Hey folks, welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is episode 155. My name's Dan Lizette, and thank you for once again taking the time to join me and tune in. And aren't you guys impressed? Coming back with a brand new episode so soon after my recent conversation with Manoush Zamarodi and Jen Poyant of Zigzag, brand new show from Radiotopia. Go back and listen to that one if you've not yet checked it out. It was a great conversation. Similarly, I've got another great conversation for you guys today. If you are listening to this on release day, yesterday, the season finale of season 2 of In the Dark from APM Reports was released, and it has been one of my favorite shows in 2018. If you've not listened to it, I could not recommend it more strongly. It has been an amazing journey, an amazing demonstration of investigative reporting and some of the things that are going on in this country that you may not have heard about. So my guests this week, of course, are host and lead reporter Madeleine Baran and senior producer Samara Freemark from APM. And actually had Madeleine as a guest way back when, actually at the end of 2016, during season 1 of In the Dark. This time I got to spoke with both Madeleine and Samara. So it was a great conversation, and they went deep into kind of how this show was made, what the process was like, and what their kind of goals were, and what the feedback's been like, and so on and so forth. I found it a super interesting conversation. I hope that you do too. And I hope you share it with a friend. Tell folks about the Podcast Digest. I'm trying hard every day to bring you guys some of the best in-depth interviews about the shows that you love. So if you like the show, tell a friend. Check me out on Twitter. That is my main communication vehicle, @Pod Digest. If you really love the show, hop on over to Patreon. There's a link in the show notes. That would be greatly appreciated as well. So without further ado, here comes episode 155 of the Podcast Digest. Madeleine Baran, Samara Freemark from In the Dark. All right, folks, welcome back. As I mentioned up front, my guests this week, very excited to make their return to the Podcast Digest. Well, one of the two. We have Madeleine Baran, host and lead reporter, and Samara Freemark, senior producer of In the Dark Season 2. Welcome back, ladies, to the Podcast Digest.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks for joining me. I can tell you what, I need to ask you guys to excuse me right up front, because there's going to be a lot of awe and wow and how'd you do this out of me. I'm going to do my best to tamp it down. Okay. So if that comes through too much, I apologize in advance, but so Madeleine, you were here back in November of 2016, folks. If you're just coming to Into Dark for the first time, and maybe you just started with season 1 or something like that, Madeleine and I chatted about season 1, but that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about season 2, which is, at the time of recording, folks, we are on the eve of the final episode. Is that right, folks? Yes. Next week, as we record, 10 just dropped today, which I listened to before our conversation, which was wonderful. So take us from, and either one of you who feels wants to jump on this one, take us from the tail end of season 1 to how we got to season 2.
Sure. So this is Samara. So after we finished up with season 1, we were starting to look around for story ideas for the second season, and we had actually put out a call to listeners of the podcast to see a call for story ideas, and we got just tons of them, like thousands, I think, emails, Twitter messages, everything. And so we spent a lot of time like sifting through all of these story ideas that were coming in, and we had some story ideas of our own as well. And so we just took a couple of months to really report out a handful of stories that seemed like they might be promising. And one of the stories that came in through that listener call out was just this very, very simple message from a woman in Mississippi saying that there was this man named Curtis Flowers who had been tried 6 times for the same crime. And she thought that he might be innocent. And the thing that struck us about that email right away was just that it didn't seem possible. We were really surprised to see this thing about someone being tried 6 times for the same crime. And so we did a little bit of digging and found out that actually, yes, that was true. And so then, of course, we had this question of like, how the heck does that happen? And it was just a very like that question was fascinating to us. And so we spent a couple of months doing some preliminary reporting on that, as well as some other stories. And then just realizing over the course of those months that there was just so much more to this story. And we just couldn't get it out of our minds. And, just decided that it was the perfect story for the second season.
Right. Because like the question for us was, how can this happen? How can someone be tried 6 times? So that's the starting question. But then the more we looked into the case, it's not just that, this is a case where the evidence is questionable, where there is a lot of faulty forensic science, for example, being used. But more than that, where we really see the intersection of race in the criminal justice system. So we see the district attorney, Doug Evans, the prosecutor in this case, using his strikes against Black people, striking Black people off the jury because they're Black, the finding of the court in this case. And so there are all of these issues. There's the issue of how can you be tried 6 times and how do we get here? And really what they all have to do with is the power of one person, the prosecutor. So really season 2, when you think about it, is about the power of prosecutors in this country. And in this particular case, the power of a prosecutor in a case where it could not be higher stakes, a death penalty case.
It was interesting when you mentioned that. You're absolutely correct. The power of prosecutors reminds me of, and you guys have been so busy, I don't know if you've had a chance to listen to this at all, but about 3 or 4 weeks ago, so almost mid-season on season 2 of In the Dark, and it was funny because they were consecutive in my podcast playlist. I listened to the guys over at Pod Save America talk to John Legend. And John Legend was starting a campaign to talk about get to know your DA. And he was saying a lot of the same type of thing about most people don't understand and know how much power a district attorney really has in terms of just even trying or not trying a case and so on and so forth. And it was interesting to kind of come to that realization that that was such a central theme with Doug Evans in the story you guys are reporting. And then to hear kind of this activist type movement being made around the country for folks to kind of understand this. It was kind of a nice 1-2 punch of awakening for me as a listener.
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue that people are looking more and more at, not just activists, but, people that interact with the courts, judges, defense attorneys, fellow prosecutors. I mean, this is an issue. If you look at the DA in Philadelphia, I mean, the issues around prosecutors and the power of prosecutors in this country is something that lots of people are caring about in a way and discussing in a way that maybe they weren't a couple years ago even, to the point where, whole elections, if you look at the race in Philadelphia, are won largely on this type of question. I mean, like, are prosecutors abusing their power? Are prosecutors, exercising discretion wisely? And what can happen? I think people are starting to understand what can happen when a prosecutor does not exercise discretion in a wise and just manner. If we don't interact with the criminal justice system, it's easy to not realize the full power of a prosecutor. It's the sort of thing you might realize when you do come into contact, that here's a person who has the ability to charge you with a crime, who has the ability to take you to trial, has the ability to even, in some parts of the country, for certain crimes, ask a jury to have you executed. One person has this power, and often that person is elected.
It's been an eye-opening experience for me, that's for sure. And I think you're right. I think a lot more people are starting to understand, not the least of which has at least been some reinforcement with the story that you have told here. So let's go back. When you decide to settle on this story, one of the things that hit me that was just mentioned in passing, but I think listeners will find really interesting that I really wanted to kind of highlight is the two of you, I believe, and several of the team members that were involved in reporting and telling the story, you guys moved in, right? You moved into town. You didn't go down there to report. You moved in.
Well, I should say, this is Samara. Madeleine moved in, and some other people on our team did too. I spent a fair amount of time there, but yes, I should qualify it with that. But I'll let Madeleine talk about the experience of actually living there for a very long time.
Yeah. So we moved down. I mean, with, like Samara said, several members of our team lived there with me for long periods of time, and then other people, kind of switch in and out. When we decided to do this story, there really wasn't a conversation of, well, should we move there or shouldn't we? It's just, to do this story, we needed to move there because this is a story that we knew was going to require a lot of reporting, and not just reporting, but also the kind of reporting that you get when you live in a place and you get to know people, and, you get to see, whole seasons pass. You get to see, kids go to school, get let out of school, just the sort of rhythm of a town that you get when you're there for the length that we were. And just the scope of the reporting was such that we just needed that much time. I mean, we really used every last day of that time while we were there gathering information. I mean, every day, like waking up, going and knocking on doors, or in the case of our reporter, Parker Yesko, like trying to find documents, going to all these courthouses. So on the one hand, it seems like a long period of time, but when we were doing it, I mean, it really seemed like, it was very packed while we were down there. And I think that, it was interesting too to see, this is a small town. And so over the course of the year, we really got to know a lot of people down there to the point where, now we know a considerable number of people in that town.
Upon first arrival, Madeleine, what was the local reception like?
I mean, we just started interviewing people when we got there. And so, I think people were, it really depends. I mean, it depends how you view the Curtis Flowers case, how you view reporters talking about the Flowers case and wanting to know more about it or look into it. So for people who thought that Curtis Flowers was innocent or thought that they didn't know whether he's innocent or guilty, but thought that the evidence was questionable or that there was a problem with what the prosecutor was doing, then people were very eager to have us there because, this is a case that's gotten a lot of attention locally. I mean, people talk about it all the time, but it's not gotten a whole lot of attention from reporters outside the town. For people who think that Curtis Flowers is guilty, it really depended. I mean, there were some people that were definitely not interested in having reporters look into it. And then there were other people who did give us, very generously some of their time. But, it's like any other reporting assignment. You just go there and you get started and one person leads you to another. And so you just have to start just kind of putting in the work.
One of the things that I've read in reviews, and I'm sure that you guys have been blown away by the reviews. There have been a lot of wonderful things said about both season 1 and season 2. I mean, a Peabody from season 1, that happened since we last spoke. Congratulations. But one of the things that I read a lot about is sort of the narrative component of it, the story, as you've put it together, as the team has put it together, and it is a phenomenal listen. And I'm kind of wondering, when you move down there and you start this reporting, how does this narrative come together? How early or late in the process did this thread sort of start to present itself?
So all of our work is driven by a question. And so from the beginning, this podcast was driven by this question of how could this happen? And so I think that the process of answering, if a question is an interesting question, the process of answering it is going to be interesting too. So it took us more than a year of reporting to understand this case to the level that we understand it now and to understand what's going on. So it's not like we knew what this story was until, it took a long time to get to the point where we knew what the story was and what the narrative arc of the story was, and certainly how the episodes would be put together, because we just didn't know that, because we had to report to get to the point where we would know those things. So from the beginning, we trust that there will be a narrative arc because we trust that we'll be able to find things out. But what that arc is wholly contingent on what we discover. And it takes a really long time to make those discoveries. And I think it's one thing that I hope sort of sets our work apart from a lot of other stuff out there, which is that I think we're doing really strong investigative journalism, and we are showing that investigative journalism, we're showing it on air, what it looks like and what we're finding out in the process of discovery. But, we do not know what we're going to find out when we set off into the field.
Yeah. And what we did with season 2 is we did a few months of reporting before we committed to this story. So we, received this email like Samara was talking about, and then we spent several months looking into the story before saying, okay, this is a story we're going to do. And so, once we begin that process, it really, then we're just in reporting, and we end up, getting into a point where we're nearing the end of the reporting, and then we start talking about, okay, what are some, different storyboarding ideas, what could go where, and all that goes through, many edits. I mean, what you're trying to do with all investigative reporting is you have these really important facts that you've found out that have been kept hidden and are important. So you want those facts to shine through. And so all of the architecture of a story is helping make that clear, and so for us, with this season, there's so much going on in the story, but what was most important is our findings, are the findings clear? This is a story, at the end of the day, it's a story about somebody who might be executed and the evidence against him and the power of the prosecutor. So yeah, we're kind of combining with investigative reporting. We have certain facts that are not flexible, and they're in the story. And then we think about, how to tell that story. And also with a story like this, we have so much material that we've gathered by the end of it. So, that's where, really having some lengthy conversations about structure are important because, we're talking about, we're talking about a year's worth of reporting where we spent basically at least 6 days of the week with a team of several people interviewing people all day. So, it's like, or looking at documents or something. So there's an organization that takes place in the reporting and like the reporting threads we're pursuing. And then also when we're thinking about the story, there's a lot of different ways to think about putting something together. So we'll like get into a room and we'll just start talking things through.
One of the things that I try to do, which I could never do, and from a practical standpoint, which is, put myself in your shoes in this situation that I know I just would have no ability to do. And I'm kind of wondering, as I'm listening to this, how you do it, which is, remember I said I'd say that, when you've come up against some of these facts, when you talk to, say, one of the witnesses who says, yeah, they offered to, pay me for that, or I'd see reward money, or my charges would get dropped, and yeah, I made it up. Or there's just this feeling that I get that if I'm in your shoes, I'm just like, I'm running to somebody, to a judge somewhere, to a courthouse, that would just make me feel like, look at this. And it's obviously something you can't do, but how do you combat that urge? Because it must be there, yes?
Well, the fact of the matter is in this case that, a lot of the things that we're talking about are things that are known to the courts and are known to the prosecutor. It's largely, in some ways, an investigation of what happened in the trials with the legal system. In terms of like wanting to tell someone, the telling of someone is the reporting process and the publishing process. So that's who we're telling. So, we haven't come across a situation where we felt a need to deviate from that. But, on a practical level in this case, that's what we're, the closest probably we came to informing someone about our findings in the legal system. I did interview the DA, Doug Evans, and, asked to sit down with him and review all of our findings and get his response. And we talked he gave me about 11 minutes, and he declined to sit down and have that conversation, which I should say as well that I did also offer to Curtis's defense, but they declined to do that as well. So for us, we just want to get the facts and put them out there, and then what people make of them or do with them is up for them to decide. And also, we have these moments, where we find something out that seems like it's really important. But, and sometimes I think, yes, sometimes those moments are really exciting or not exciting, but like really revelatory when they happen. But actually, a lot of times they are not, because a lot of times what they actually look like are immediately raising doubt, like everyone on the team raising doubts about this and asking critical questions. And it's not until we satisfy all those questions that even becomes something that we think is true or can prove is true, which is the next step before reporting it. So even some of these like relatively like larger moments in the podcast really have a lot of additional reporting around them. So when they actually unfold, sometimes they are not, because we haven't, confirmed everything yet, they're not quite as dramatic as they might in real life, as that they might seem,
right,
when you're hearing it all at once with all the reportings kind of condensed. Does that make sense, Samara?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I was going to say the same thing. Like by the time we make the editorial decision to present something to the listeners as like a big revelation, and through the writing, through the music we use, through like the placement we give it in a story, like by the time we have gotten to the point where we're making that decision, we have done so much reporting around that thing. And it's taken a really long time to get to the point where we feel comfortable, ethically comfortable and journalistically comfortable with making that decision. Because it's a big thing to put something out in front of a lot of people and say like, hey, this is really important. And it's very important to us that we be right and that the information that we're putting out is correct and is responsible.
I want to pivot just real quick as I'm just thinking about all this effort. And I know we touched upon this last time, Madeleine, very briefly, and it has been more of a call to action, let's say, in season 2. But talk to me a little bit about the support of APM and the costs of doing something like this. I know that you guys are appealing to listener support directly now, which I think is spectacular. But just moving a crew down there for this long, doing this kind of hours, 6 days a week, as you mentioned, this has got to be expensive and exhausting. I'm just wondering, what's it like to plow through something like this in terms of your support system?
Well, we're really fortunate at APM Reports that we exist only to do this kind of long form work. So American Public Media has made a decision to create several years ago one national investigative and documentary team that we are a part of. So In the Dark is part of that national team. And so this is the kind of work that the company has determined and believes is important, has heard from listeners is important, and we know is important. And so we're fortunate to work for a company that believes in all of those things. And we know that listeners believe in those things as well. So, we're not in a newsroom. So we're not, we don't have daily work that, we also have to do breaking news and things like that. This is actually all we're doing. It is a big investment. I mean, I don't think that there's a whole lot of news organizations that would send an entire team, to another state for nearly a year to look into a death penalty case. Right. There are news organizations that would do that, but they're few and far between. And so I'm just glad to work for one of them.
Yeah. And I'm curious, I'm assuming this has been successful. The listener involvement now, the membership model, if you will, has that been great for you guys?
I mean, we're not on the money side at all, which is another
Gotcha.
blessing of our situation is that we're very removed from that. So I couldn't give you any kind of figures or say anything about that at all. I mean, I think what's gratifying for us is seeing engagement. So whether that's like people on Twitter, people emailing, like we get a lot of contact from people about the podcast. And so that's the kind of response that we're familiar with, but we can't really talk to the money stuff just because it's not our department.
And also, we've been seeing a lot, in the last couple of weeks in particular, as season 2 the episodes keep coming out, our conversations, of course, like across the country about these findings, but also a lot of conversation in Winona, Mississippi, in those surrounding towns about this case in a way that hasn't really happened to that level in a long time. And people coming forward to each other and just sharing experiences and sharing their own thoughts and debating things and talking about things. And, you can go on Facebook and see, people in Winona sort of talking about what to make of this, like what should we do, or what do you think about this? And so, for us, that's incredibly important. I should also say that the other thing that we did for this season, which we thought was really important, was we wanted to have this not just exist solely in a podcast form. So we did work with the Mississippi newspaper, the largest paper in Mississippi, the Clarion Ledger, to have published kind of shorter, very condensed versions of each episode so that like the key findings of each episode would be published in the statewide newspaper so that people who aren't listening to podcasts, which frankly is still a lot of people, right, who we feel, need this information, want this information, deserve to have this information, can read about it in their local paper. So I think we're always also thinking about, what are the other ways that we can get this information in the hands of more people?
And you talked about the impact the show was having in the town. And I read recently, I think you tweeted about this, Madeleine, that there has now been an online petition started to recall Doug Evans.
Right. So it's not actually like a recall petition, but someone did start. And I don't actually know who started it. It's an online petition basically demanding the recall of the DA, Doug Evans. So that's something that has started which has, a fair number of local names on it that I recognize, but also a lot of people outside of Winona as well. For a long time, there are people in Winona who knew about this story and, knew a lot about it, were very frustrated by certain things that were going on. And so they're also now looking at, the rest of the country and thinking and saying to me and to others, what is the rest of the United States going to make of this? This case that we've had here now for more than 2 decades.
One of the things another thing that I find must be very tough to do is there is almost, and this is very much the same way in season 1, the team and you, Madeleine, as a narrator, pretty much almost never, I think is safe to say, inject personal opinion. But I know, as a human being, you've got a personal perspective, as maybe one stronger than anyone from being so close to this story. How tough is that to make sure that that doesn't get into the reporting?
I mean, you're always looking out for, whatever your own personal bias may be. And that's where, editors come into play working on a large team. But I think that we are operating so far on the other end of caution with that, like you said, I mean, we do not engage in speculation. We don't engage. I mean, we don't go close to that line. And so, the rare times where we do make a conclusion have high impact because they so rarely occur in the podcast, and they're supported by facts when they do happen. I mean, to me, it's like, I'm not interested in being like an op-ed columnist or something like that. So it's actually not that difficult for me personally to restrain from that in the writing or something like that. I mean, I think that we're collecting facts, and the facts are what they are. And then you go through the process of editing to like look at individual lines or to question some of your reporting and say, have I really talked to every last person in this category I can talk to? I mean, another thing that we do a lot on our team is just basically like kind of a thought exercise of like, okay, is there a way that all of these findings could be true once we know that they're true, but maybe it means something different than what we're thinking about, so maybe there's a way in which all of this makes sense, in which the person in charge didn't do anything wrong. Like, what would be the other explanation? Or what would be the sort of fact that would come in and upend the whole thing? Is there a fact like that out there? And so we're always kind of thinking about the ways in which we can be wrong. And we're never thinking, here's what I know, here's what I personally believe, because it's irrelevant. It really is irrelevant if the facts don't show it. And so it's really just making sure that you're not overlooking something, I think, more than anything. And that is like a really rigorous process of reporting and editing, where sometimes you realize, we need to go to another state and we have to talk to these 6 people or something. It's never going to be in the podcast, but we just have to do it to assure ourselves we haven't missed something. And so there's also a lot of stuff that's not in the podcast or in a lot of investigative reporting, I should say. This is not like a unique idea to our team. I mean, this is basic investigative reporting,
right?
Where you're doing a lot of work that you don't see to determine the things that you do report.
And the stakes here are so high. I mean, yes, it's a death penalty case, as Madeleine said, but the stakes are high for everyone we talk to. I mean, we've talked to hundreds of people, and that decision to talk to us is not an easy one for some people, and it's a decision that we take, that we weigh very heavily, and that we try to take care of people's stories and like be responsible with them, because we just don't want to lose sight of the fact that like there are stakes for everyone involved in this.
I can imagine. I mean, the DA is still in office. A lot of these are family or friends or fellow town people they've known for their whole lives. They may be making comments about you. Absolutely. That's got to be wildly intimidating. And I think in the New Yorker story I read from a few weeks ago, Madeleine, I believe you said about one of the reasons for moving down was to build that trust and have folks decide if they're going to trust you or not. And it comes through that obviously with an overwhelming majority of folks, this trust was achieved.
Mm-hmm. And I should say too, Samara was saying earlier, this being difficult for everyone. I mean, I think what you were getting at, I mean, it's difficult also on the victims' families. Like just to talk at least for a little bit about this. I mean, it's hard to imagine sitting through one trial where someone in your family has been killed, let alone 2 trials or 3 or 6. And so,
it's insane.
Yeah. And so, I mean, there is also, it was important to us to not only talk to the victim's family, the family members of the victims, of people who died at the store, but also to tell that part of the story. So it was a very intentional choice in our first episode to hear from the father of one of the 16-year-old boy, Bobo Stewart, who was one of the 4 people killed in the store, because we want to understand the stakes all across the board in a case like this. And, 6 trials is not a good outcome for anyone. And so I think that there's also a lot of pain in the community of course, like, you know, on Curtis's side, feeling that he may be wrongfully convicted, and of course, on the side of the family members of the victims who have been murdered. And so I think it's just like taking care with those two things in a case that's very, very high stakes and complicated, you know, so you really are trying to be careful. You're trying to be fair. You're interviewing people multiple times when you can, because it's, you know, this is like, you know, a lot of the reporting that we do is around issues of violence or trauma. And so recognizing as well that like you do need to take some time with people. You cannot just, you know, like show up and demand like that your questions be answered. That's sort of ridiculous a lot of the time.
Yeah, one of the things I thought of when I was thinking about back to that original question, the thing that first caught your eye, which is 6 trials, which is asinine, insane, amazing. That, like you mentioned earlier, I think you mentioned it, Madeleine, that I never even heard of that before. I didn't even know that can be a thing. You know, and it was great that you explained it up front, you know, double jeopardy and how this applies and doesn't apply and so on and so forth. But what's interesting is that there could be a very easy, not thought out, not investigated, not reported story about why this white DA is doing it to this, you know, black accusant here, which is it's race and he doesn't want to lose and it's his name and he's just going to keep going at it. End of story. But you guys never go to that in the sense where that it's that simple. There's every nuance explored, every side, right down to the victim's family, to the evidence, to the forensic evidence, to the testimony. And quickly, and I don't know what this says, but I almost forget about the 6th thing. You know, by episodes 3, 4, 5, you're giving us so much information to consider and ponder and think about so many other elements of this journey that almost doesn't come back till later on when you realize, yeah, didn't you figure that out eventually?
Right. I mean, partly it's just structural, right? It's like we have to get through like the evidence at trial. So we do that. And we, you know, like that's, in this case, you know, there was some exceptions. The core case the state makes does not change. You know, some of the witnesses change, but they don't change up the theory of the crime or something like that. So yeah, there is this kind of initial period where we're really talking about like the case in general, you know, the case throughout all 6 trials sort of collectively. And then we sort of piece it out separately in like a later episode.
Yeah, I mean, if so, like I said, we did a couple of months of pre-reporting on this story before we like fully committed to it. And if in that couple of months of reporting, we had realized that the answer to this question of how 6 trials could happen was just like a purely technicality answer, you know, like, I don't even know what that would look like. But if the answer to that had been very simple and very bureaucratic and boring, we would not have chosen to do the podcast. So,
right.
So it was only, we realized there was a lot more there.
And I should also say too, on the question of race, I mean, I agree that, you know, like you could do a very quick version of this story that would make some very generic conclusions perhaps. But on the other hand, I mean, what we've seen in this case is that the Mississippi Supreme Court has ruled that the DA in this case has engaged in racial discrimination in jury selection. So it is not a case where we're talking about, you know, something like unconscious bias or something like that. I mean, we're talking about a finding of the state Supreme Court that the DA intentionally struck Black people from jury in the Curtis Flowers case because they were Black. And then, you know, the court has even called some of his reasons for doing so, their word is fabrications. So we are seeing like the powerful role that race is playing in this case. And so I think it's also important to have the time to report into that. So, because that's no more like an allegation. I mean, that's proven in this case, I guess is what I want to say. It's
right.
Not like an interpretation or something like that. That's a proven finding.
And that's a finding by the court. But then, of course, we did a ton of reporting to deepen that finding, like the jury stuff.
Sure.
I can brag on this because I was less integrally involved in this reporting. It was other people on the team who really slaved to make this finding happen, which is the finding about what's going on in jury selection and all of the other trials.
Yeah, what we found was that the DA, Doug Evans, was striking Black people off his juries at a rate 4.5 times white people, not just the Curtis Flowers case, but going back 20-some years, basically his entire record of as DA, as many trials as we could get.
And that's a great segue to what I wanted to raise next. And folks, listening to this is something that I don't often point out. And in the case of In the Dark, it definitely needs to. I was reminded of that topic with the jury selection because right before we hopped on, I was going through the website and making sure that I had caught up on everything. And I saw the awesome video with the chess pieces.
Oh, yeah. That's Curtis Gilbert.
Cool.
And yeah. Yep. That's our reporter on our team.
Yeah. And episode by episode, there is a wealth of information, pictures, photos, videos, screenshots and of the actual notes that are referenced and documents. And it's all there. It's amazing to me because if this was all packaged up with no podcast, and I'm thinking back to 10 years ago, let's say, this could be like a Time magazine 20-page spread just linking all these together. And it would be, just something with as much impact, but throw in the audio there. And folks, I want to make sure, link in the show notes, go through, especially as you're listening, even better. If you haven't started yet, do it with these amazing entries on the website. The reason I'm emphasizing this is I hadn't done it. I hadn't done it until today, and I'm guilty of that. And I think everyone is, and folks need to check it out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. This may wind into the next thing. You mentioned, Samara, the team. And I want to talk about all these other folks that aren't on the line with us today because so many people I know gave out so much time and effort and energy. So take it from the chess story on to highlight some of these folks and their contributions.
Oh, man, nothing would make me happier. So we have just an incredible team. They are amazing. Okay, so let's see. Where should we start from? So our producer, so there's me and Madeleine. And then our producer is Natalie Jablonski. And Natalie spent a lot of time in the field with Madeleine, like months and months and months. She spent a lot of time down there.
And when we think about, like, for example, the section of the story that talks about the history of the Grenada civil rights movement in the 60s, that is one of the areas that shows basically Natalie claimed ownership over and did a lot of reporting in. The archival tape that you hear in that is tape that Natalie found. And she was there in Mississippi for very, very long periods of time. I mean, she was basically just down there.
And then our associate producer is Raymond Tungakar, and another amazing producer. He also spent a lot of time in Mississippi. And also he was doing a lot of field reporting and producing, but also just did a ton of work especially on forensics. So episode 3, which has a lot to do with the gun and the ballistics research or the ballistics experts that were used to make the links that were used in trial to link the gun to the bullets. Raymond did a ton of work in really understanding that and nailing down the reporting that needed to happen for that episode.
And then we have a reporter, Parker Yesko, who spent months and months going, as you hear in the podcast, going from courthouse to courthouse in north central Mississippi with her scanner, scanning court documents. But not just that. I mean, Parker played so many other roles in this investigation as well. I mean, everyone on our team, whether they're a reporter or producer, they're also doing both of those jobs. So Parker also did a lot of other reporting. She also sometimes acted as a producer. So we see that with like Natalie and Raymond as well.
Will Craft.
And then Will Craft, our data reporter, who took the raw material from Parker and then analyzed it for months and months and months and cleaned up the data, working with our team. But that jury selection data is Will Craft's work. I mean, that is his analysis, checked by statisticians. So, and then on top of that, we have our editor, Catherine Winter, who so much of the smart writing decisions that get made or edits that get made can be credited to Catherine.
And I got to just say hats off, too, because I'm no expert, but I listen to a lot of shows, and In the Dark has both seasons been one of the most consistently well-edited shows I think that's out there. So I want to give a hats off to Catherine because that's been
great.
Amazing.
We love her.
Yes. And then our engineers, of course. I mean, I feel like this is kind of like almost going on too long, except that this is one of our favorite topics of conversation. Yeah. So, but just so people know, so we have amazing engineers too, who, both make things sound wonderful and also reduce problems that you never will know about, in difficult field conditions. So, but yeah, I mean, I think, and what we try to do on the podcast is show some of that work. It's obviously, as like we're talking here, it's so obvious that it's not just, me and Samara doing this work. And we want to show that on the podcast as well, that, this is the sort of team that it takes. Like if newsrooms want to invest in serious investigative reporting, this is the sort of resources that you need to, you really should consider devoting to it if you can. especially in a larger newsroom, because, we don't want to give the impression that this is something that even one person could do with a year and a half. I mean, it really is not. And we're just really fortunate to work with people that the whole team just shares the same commitment to the importance of investigative reporting, the importance of serious journalism, and brings, very, different and complementary skills and experiences to that.
So behind closed doors during the reporting, 6 months in, do you guys ever on that 7th day sit back and be like, this is going to be great. This is going to be awesome. Is it a feeling that you're part of something special? I mean, because this is just the end product after all this has just got to feel like, I don't know, it's like winning a World Series or something like that. Someone would be like, I was part of something great,
Feels much more, does not feel necessarily like that all the time. I mean, I do think that, where we're able to bring our journalism and our journalism skills and, writing and editing skills to bear on a topic like this. I mean, we do feel that is important. And so there is a feeling of, being glad that this information is out there. And, in this case, finding out, I mean, when Samara talked to Odell Cookie Hallman, it turns out he's now saying, he made up a story under oath in the case of Curtis Flowers, a death penalty case, the only direct piece of evidence against Curtis Flowers. And now we are the ones who learn that story isn't true. That's a really important fact. And so I would find that important if we found it out or if someone else found it out. So I'm just glad that we found it out. I mean, and so I think, what has been interesting to as well, what I like a lot about the process of investigative reporting is I always think about it like a process of learning how dumb you were yesterday, so it's just kind of like that's what I thought yesterday. Okay, that was wrong, or that was half true, or that was a nuance or something. I'm talking about the early on in the reporting process. I'm talking, frankly, about 6 months of stuff where you're really just making your way through and you don't know very much and you're aware of how little you know. And so you're not making any conclusions, but you're just sort of thinking in your head, well, what if this person is lying or this person, or what if all these people are, what if all these people are telling the truth, or, and you're not coming to any conclusions. Or you've only talked to, you think there's 10 people you need to talk to in this category, and a week later you learn there's 65. Or something. So you're always learning what you didn't know before. And to me, that is one of the most gratifying parts of reporting, where you can tell that you are learning more, and then you get to a point after in this case, a year and a half's worth of reporting, where really the last several months of your reporting, you're not having those moments. You're really just accumulating additional information. And you're really at this point almost seeking to deconstruct the story. You're actively engaged in a process of looking for things that would prove wrong very well-established facts in your reporting, and you're not finding them. And so, but the initial process is really you're just learning things, and you have to be not only open to things that's the fun of reporting. That's the process of discovering things. And, you really, with this story, there are many times where, with the episode today, I'll just point out, I never expected that I would be in an abandoned plastics factory looking through documents. And yet there we were.
Oh, and those pictures. I mentioned, you should see the pictures, folks.
Oh, man, you should watch the video online.
I watched it,
crazy.
Yes.
But also, yeah. And I think too, we, when we did our initial reporting in this season, we wanted to confirm certain facts. We wanted to do a couple months of reporting. But then when you are reporting, you do have findings. You do realize, we had our analysis of the jury data. We had our analysis of Doug Evans' strikes going back 20-some years. And you're learning those things as you go along the reporting, and you are validated in your belief that this is an important story. You didn't need this additional information to believe it was an important story. But as is often the case with investigative reporting, the more time you spend, the more you realize is taking place that should not be, that it's a process of, in this case at least, realizing that there was a whole lot more going on than we had ever thought. And so we didn't, from a story or journalism perspective, need more to be going on, but that's just the process of reporting. You just find things. We found that people said they never said the things they said that were in investigative notes. Things that you can't imagine what you're going to find until you get out there and do it. And so I think what I would like really encourage, like, is for people to just engage in reporting, like to just go out and, you know, like, you just don't know what you're going to find until you start doing it. And so you really can't think about story structure. You can't think about any of that stuff until you have information that no one knows. And you have to find something or some perspective that isn't out there.
And I think in America in 2018, nothing could be more important than investigative journalism at this point. I don't think there's any doubt that that's a true statement. So let's run through some future things that people out there are wondering for sure. We are a few days away from the season finale. Can folks expect, or will this still to be determined, an awesome update episode in the future like we had with season 1?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it. I mean, so this case is not at all over. You know, Curtis still is in appeals. His case has actually 2 parallel appeals taking place right now. And so we are committed to continuing to keep people updated on major developments in the story. You know, we don't know, will Curtis win his appeal? Will he get a 7th trial? We didn't do this to have like a podcast season. I mean, we have a commitment to the story and to keeping people like updated on that. So in terms of like what that actually might look like, I have no idea. I mean, but definitely, I mean, the easiest way for people to stay up to date on major updates is to like this is going to sound cheesy, but like stay subscribed to the feed, because if there are big updates, we would push them out through in the dark feeds, like in, iTunes and everywhere else.
We have a mailing list too. If we're going to go full on.
If we are, but
emotional, yeah.
But this is
APMreports.org.
Yeah. But I mean, I do think that listeners who have gone all the way through this with us at this point, we're in the 10th episode, about to be in the 11th, are doing that because they care about what's going on in this case and want to know what is going to happen. And we don't know what's going to happen yet. And the courts have not ruled yet. And so it's very important to keep people updated on that process as it goes along. So, I mean, we're obviously at some point going to be turning towards season 3, which is something that we haven't thought at all about. But we are going to update people in season 2. Yes, I assumed you would ask. Yes.
Yes. Well, and I was going to ask it in the way that was like, I know nothing's definite yet, but is it safe to say there will be, just no idea what or when?
Yeah, we haven't figured out what it would be, and we haven't even come close to figuring that out. And we haven't talked about it. I'll put it that. I mean,
fair enough.
So yeah, we just don't know. I mean, this season has really, much more than season 1, pushed the team to, in a way that season 1 did not, in terms of just the sheer amount of reporting and writing and production. So once we kind of come up from this last episode and are able to think a little bit going forward, then we'll start having those conversations. I will say, though, when you think about season 2, like it started with a very simple email that ended up in a 1.5 years worth of work. So if people have ideas for stories they think should be covered, definitely get in touch with us. Stories of, we're interested in stories of wrongdoing or alleged wrongdoing, powerful people doing something that is harming less powerful people. Even if it's just a suspicion or a guess, that's kind of where we come in as a reporter. So, we have already gotten some of those suggestions and anticipate getting many more.
Well, I'll tell you what, I put this out on Twitter a couple of weeks ago that I thought season 2 of In the Dark might be the best show of 2018. It might be better than Serial season 1. And I said that midstream because it hadn't finished up yet. I'm getting to the point where I think those are safe conclusions. The only other one that I will put up there with 2018, and I say this only as a compliment because, and I'm sure you've heard this work as well, the Daily's special with Caliphate has been amazing. Talk about investigative journalism as well. So I'll put you both in the same breath, and I mean that as a compliment. I think it's that high kind of quality of work. So
yeah, we are seeing some amazing, I should just say, long form reporting happening right now. I mean, both in long form audio reporting and documentary reporting, print reporting, online reporting. I mean, we are in a moment of seeing a tremendous need and interest in and commitment to, in some quarters of this country, in news organizations across this country, investigative reporting. And I think that the more that people demand investigative reporting, the more we'll see. And I think that it's very clear that people are willing to stick with complex stories that take many hours to unfold, and that people can, listeners are smart. Like, they can tell the difference between something that is well reported and something that isn't. And And they're smart enough, too, to ask like the right questions. And so that really can only be answered in a longer format. And so I hope that we just keep seeing more and more of, we want to see a lot more investigative reporting in the audio space. And I think that's going to happen.
Yeah, I look at it embedded, right? Embedded from NPR. You know, that show has their coal stories over the past few months as well has been more examples of great investigative work. And I'm with you. Let's keep it coming. And I'll be in the crowd in the demanding and listening and interacting for sure. So I don't want to take up too much of your time. So Madeleine Baran, Samara Freemark, thank you both so much for joining me and telling us a little bit more about In the Dark Season 2. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much
Thanks for having us. It's great talking to you.
And folks, links for all the things that we mentioned in the show notes, to the newsletter, to the website, to subscribe to the show. It'll all be right there. So thanks for listening.
Thanks so much.
And folks, that'll do it for episode 155 of the Podcast Digest. Hope that you enjoyed. I am doing my best to pick up the pace of interviews and releases, and I hope you guys are enjoying. And if you are, again, please tell a friend or follow me on Twitter at Pod Digest. That's where I do all the main communication about all things the Podcast Digest. And again, tell a friend. I really do. I think word of mouth is the way these shows spread, and I hope that's how it gets its big attention. And just one quick announcement as well. I was recently a guest on the Bitrate podcast. I will put a link in the show notes as well for that. That was a couple of gentlemen I joined, and I talked a little bit about this episode and others about booking guests was kind of the main topic, although we touched on a bunch of different things, and kind of how I go about sort of reaching out to guests and what my process has been over these nearly 4 years of producing this show. So it was an interesting conversation. Hope you find it as well. So Bitrate was the show that I was a guest on. So if you have a show suggestion for me, a host or producer that you'd love me to reach out to and attempt to connect with and to publish for a future episode of the Podcast Digest, hit me up on Twitter at Pod Digest or thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. Until next time, folks, my name is Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest.